movie. I've heard warnings before about this movie that it's too romantic and girls should not watch this movie because it sets up false expectations, right, for marriage. And so I couldn't remember where I'd heard that, so I did a web search and I searched for the phrase, "Do not watch Pride and Prejudice." This was on the first page of searches. It's from a girl named Keely. Her blog in 2010, she wrote, at the end of it, she wrote about how she's romantic, and then at the end of it she wrote, "Note to women, do not watch Pride and Prejudice more than once a week. I have become a disgusting, hopeless romantic and can now feel my heart aching for my true love before I go to bed every night. Where is my Mr. Darcy?" So, do you think this movie is dangerous for girls?
Dangerous for him, anyway. Whoever him
Might be shocked to learn that I've never seen the movie. So
No, there's probably a lot that's the reason that I want to talk about it here before you watch it, because this is a movie in another culture, and as you watch it, some things won't make sense because, you know, what happens in the 1700s isn't really the same. So first, let's talk about Jane Austen. She was born in December 1775, so the American Revolutionary War was about 8 months old and getting into the outbreak phase. This was a Christian society, so think about, and Christian you can put in quotes, right? So think about like the Scarlet Letter and the shame that attaches to a person and their family if they commit sin. That's going to be kind of important as you watch this.
Dan, was she American or British?
She was British. Yeah, Scarlet Letter was not British, but kind of similar time period. So something will happen in Pride and Prejudice that will shame the whole family. Okay, and you got to know that it's bad. So Jane Austen was the 7th child of 8 and the 2nd daughter of 2 daughters. I think this is important because it gives us a little bit of a clue when we try to look into the movie and the book and say, why are these kids in this family like they are, the different ones? And so we're going to try to make some inferences, we're going to try to make some guesses about that. So that's a clue for you to think about that. She grew up in a church. Her father was actually a pastor. She never married. There's a book called Becoming Jane. Actually, the book's called Becoming Jane Austen, and there was a movie made, Becoming Jane. I don't remember if it was it. Yeah, we went to the movie, remember? Because I remember as we walked out of the movie, there were like 2 different cars parked outside. One said Pemberley, and one said something about Darcy. So I'm like, okay. There was only like 3 people in that movie when we went. So. I remember afterwards thinking that was kind of a dumb movie, so I'm not recommending this movie. It's just interesting. But she wrote Pride and Prejudice when she was 37, and she died when she was 41. So she died fairly young, and she never married. So why did she never marry? It came out really badly, but here's a drawing of her. Of her face. She didn't have a really cheerful look on her face. You should see the rest of it. Okay.
She was a ghost.
Drawing academic.
All right, so this is an interesting slide. I'll just roll it.
Oh man.
Pride and Prejudice has spawned a lot of second stories where people write, okay, what happens to Darcy and Elizabeth afterwards? And there's actually
There's a lot of them.
there's a lot of them. So this story, even if you watch this movie and say that was dumb, it connected with some people.
Only a few.
There's actually one that is called Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, and this is actually going to be a movie this winter. So for those of you that are really maybe you want that. So introduction to actual Pride and Prejudice. So those of you that study writing. Pride and Prejudice, the book is written third person omniscient. Can anyone say what that is?
That's where,
It's not the character.
What?
It's she did this, and then 10,000 miles away, he also did this. So it's not following one person. And
Right.
It's not the person.
So third person means it's a narrator who's not in the story that's telling it. Omniscient means that this character can read the minds of lots of people. Okay? There's also something called third person limited omniscient, which means that the person can read the minds of just one person that they follow through the story. And it gives a different feel for a story. I think this is a little bit important to this story because part of the point of Pride and Prejudice, I think, you big fans can tell me if I'm right, is that it is this character Elizabeth watching her friends fall in love and essentially criticizing them and saying, that's a dumb reason to fall in love, that's a dumb reason to fall in love, and then she herself falls in love, right? So the writer, a lot of people think that Jane Austen is the most like this Elizabeth character, and so I think her reading the minds of all these different characters as they do things is kind of interesting. But we do keep coming back to Elizabeth's mind the most. The movie, of course, doesn't do that because there's no vocal narrator, so it's really third-person objective, which is reading nobody's mind. Okay, so more vocabulary. Primogeniture. What is primogeniture? Jen?
That there needs to be a male heir in order for the family's house and goods to continue, and if not, it's going to be years after it.
Right. This was not all families. This was just big families. Okay? So if you owned the big mansion and all the land around it that a lot of other people lived in, then your house would be by law set up this way. You didn't have really a choice in it necessarily. Sometimes they could adjust it, but you know, you watch the movie and you'll think, oh, that's awful. So basically the point is that the whole possession and leadership of the house is going to go to one son, the first son. Okay. If there's no son, then it goes to some other male relative somewhere. But it has to go to a man and it has to go to one person. So why? Why would they have laws like this? It's not just misogyny. Although that's probably part of it.
Partly because it was the 17th century, so female heirs didn't really exist back then.
Partially, yeah, to a large extent. I think a lot of it, I'm going to go fast, so I'm just going to answer. A lot of it was because the household and the land around it and the running of that thing as basically like a company was more important than the individuals to society. So these households or manors could fight with one another, could take land from one another. I mean, it's kind of like gangs almost when you look at England. And so if you said, well, I have two sons, I'm going to divide it and give half to each. They could run it differently, they could make different allegiances, and pretty soon it's smaller and it's more susceptible to outside attack. So it was important that it stay, in other words, the manor is more important than the people, even the person who gets it. The point in the story is that when there's no sons, the daughters are kind of basically almost homeless people. They're going to be homeless people pretty soon. When the father dies, the house will go to somebody else and he can kick them out. And, you know, hopefully they marry before then. Also, I would suggest to you, just kind of interestingly, we sang a song that was kind of about this morning. Because in I Need Thee Every Hour, the last line is, "O make me thine indeed, thou blessed Son." So when we talk about Jesus being the blessed Son, part of it is this kind of idea, that Jesus is the inheritor of God's kingdom. He's first son, it doesn't necessarily have to do with chronological order. Like when we think first, we think, okay, he was born first. There's a lot of believers that were born before Jesus was born, although he was eternal. But the point of blessed, the point of that is that he has given the birthright, he has given the inheritance. The kingdom is his. He runs it. And we should be very thankful that we have a king who does a good job. So let's see what else. I'm going to skip this. This just has to do with their economics and how they thought about things. Okay, we're done at 45. We're done now. Okay. Okay, we're done now. There's a lot more about thinking and feeling, and I don't think we're going to have time to get back to it. We're fine? Are you guys done, or are you just coming out? Okay. All right, let's do thinking and feeling. Take note of your thoughts and your feelings as you watch this movie, right? Because the point is, you might think something's funny, and then later we'll come back and say, that's not funny, that's sad. So be sad then. And how to think a little more clearly about why that's sad instead of funny. So I want you, just to give an analogy, I want you to think about feelings. Now I think they're all coming out. Think about emotions like the movements of athletics. How many of you have played athletics where you were coached in something? Okay. When you play, after a while, you are thinking mentally about what you want the ball to do or where you want to be later. You're not thinking about all the little physical motions that take you there. Those are kind of involuntary. But they're kind of involuntary, right? You can think about them and you can retrain. And that's the point here. So, I told Tim I'd use him as an example. Let's say that Tim goes into the gym to do gymnastics, and the coach tells him, Tim, and I don't know if a coach in gymnastics really says this, so maybe this is ridiculous, but the coach says, Tim, you're moving your foot too far to the left when you take off. So then when you go to flip, you're off balance. Okay? I don't know if he says something like that, but let's say he says that. Tim could have two responses. He could say, well, I was in a gymnastics club last year, and that's how we did it, so I'm going to do it that way. It just feels right to me. Right? That's kind of in our feelings like saying, don't tell me what to feel. I feel what I feel. The second response he could have is, oh, I know that. I just do it that way because it's practice. When it gets to the competition, I'm going to put my foot in the right spot, and I'm going to do the flip, and you'll see it'll be perfect. And I want to suggest to you that stories are like your practice. And they're not the competition, they're not real life, so it's not like there's a game on the line. But how you practice with your emotions will be how you live them in your life. And so story feeling is actually important. Does that make sense? So it's also important to have a coach and to listen to a coach. So we shouldn't just send our kids off to watch movies and not talk to them about different things in them, because we're just letting them train with a club that really doesn't have a coach, essentially. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. First, Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett is older when he marries. He actually marries at about age 45, which explains why he looks older than his wife and why he seems a little bit tired towards this part of his life. As you go through your book, as you go through your handout, you'll notice that there's an area to give first impressions and later impressions. And if you've seen this movie many, many times, then you probably had your first impressions of him a long time ago, and in fact about a lot of these characters a long time ago. So try to kind of play along and remember back to the first time you saw the movie and what your initial thoughts were about him as a man and as a father and as a husband, and then when you give your latter impressions, you can say more what you're thinking now. So moving on to Mrs. Bennet, her chief anxiety is that her daughters get married, and this is because this is a real problem for her. It's not her imagined anxiety, but they really are in trouble if they don't marry, and I think that's important to her character. Elizabeth actually is the main character of the story. So I'm talking about her first, even though she's not the oldest daughter. We're going to watch her watch other people fall in love, and we're also going to watch her fall in love. Next is Jane. Jane is the pretty daughter. At one point in the movie, you can see it on the screen, Elizabeth says about her, "If every man in this room does not end the evening in love with you, then I am no judge of beauty." And that's kind of significant in the story that she's the pretty daughter. Lydia is actually the youngest, but her slightly older sister Kitty tends to kind of follow her in terms of doing what she does. The quote on the screen for her is, "Officers, officers, as far as the eye can see," and she is silly. Mr. Collins. You're going to really love Mr. Collins. Everyone kind of loves to be horrified by him. Everything he says is pure ridiculousness and confident ridiculousness. So his quote, which everyone will appreciate, is, "Nothing remains for me but to assure you in the most animated language of the violence of my affections." You can almost guess that he read that somewhere in terms of how to propose. Next is the handsome Mr. Wickham. You'll make first and later impressions about him. Next is Mr. Bingley. The only note that I have to say about him is Bing. He's handsome and good-natured. Next is his sister, Carolyn Bingley. You'll notice in this movie that she is kind of mean. And the question is, why is she mean? And so, as you think about her character, we'll ask later what her motive is for her meanness. And I think you'll be able to see it, actually. And finally, Mr. Darcy. The quote that they put up about Mr. Darcy was, "Could you expect me to rejoice in the inferiority of your circumstances?" Mr. Darcy is probably the whole point of the original title of Pride and Prejudice, which was First Impressions. So the question will be that we'll discuss about him is, what were your impressions of him? So watch this movie. We're going to watch the 2005 version. That's the one with Keira Knightley. The other one would take 6 hours and would be a big commitment to watch in a week. So watch this at least once. It actually gets better when you see it more and you kind of get more to know who they are, because there's a lot of depth and there's a lot of little things that happen in this movie that are happening for good reasons. Try to read the handout, especially the scripture passages on the one side. Read all the questions actually and the scripture passages before you watch the movie, because I want you to think about which characters go with which of those proverbs, and also you got to know which questions you're going to be trying to answer as you go through. Also notice that on the second page of the handout, it might, if you have an older version, I accidentally put Jane Bennet as someone to think about first and last impressions, but what I actually wanted there was Elizabeth. I put the wrong daughter. So I want first and later impressions about Elizabeth. And then also, we'll be asking finally the question: do you think that this movie is dangerous for girls? So kind of think about that one too. Have fun.